everybody. Welcome to the IndiNations 7 Generations Investing Podcast. I'm Jeremy Bryan, and this is powered by IndiWealth. Today, we're going to get into those tribal finance and investing issues that we feel are hot button, and we want to explain and kind of provide some detail that's hopefully helpful to you all in making decisions. So this first one is sovereignty versus volatility, and really why we believe that the time horizon modeling is the tribal fiduciary's best tool to use to really offsetting some of those volatility issues that are going to be a recurring part of being a tribal leader, whether that's an elected official or whether that's a hired official who has to answer to elected officials and their citizenship, obviously. So without any further ado, let's get started. So let's talk about a common challenge or the challenges in tribal finance is, hey, let's say you receive an asset windfall via a fund or something, a land acquisition or whatever that may be. Either that or recurring revenue that, hey, economic development, whether that's gaming, hospitality, infrastructure, energy, whatever that may be, you are now receiving recurring revenue. And as a tribal finance leader, you're saying, I want to build something for the future. And there's always something you want to build for the future to help your tribal citizens. That's what you're there for. That whether you're an elected official again or a hired official, you want to add prosperity to your tribal government, to your tribal citizenship. So from that perspective, it makes perfect sense to want to build something for the future. But when you say that, there's obviously going to be some tensions with it. First and foremost, I believe that this is always going to be the case, and you're always going to have to deal with this, is that there's immediate needs versus the long-term build out. There's always something you can use immediately. There's always something that your citizens are going to want you to use this money for, whether that is an immediate project or whether that's an immediate return of some of those assets to the citizens. There's always an immediate need versus the thought of using these resources to build out longer term prosperity. And there's always going to be a tension there. Secondarily, leadership cycles and political pressure. There is in tribal council, it's often an elected position, and it often has a cycle, whether that's 2 to 4 years in time frame. And there's going to be challenges to that during that period of time, and also as you're up for re-election. And again, this is whether you're on the council and you're being elected, or whether you're a CFO or an executive director that answers to the tribal council. There's always going to be a component of political pressure that goes along with goal attainment, especially when it comes to tribal revenue. So understand that's always going to be a push and pull, and part of the tension about building for the future versus, hey, how do we build for the future and what do we want to build? And it may change down the road depending on what the election cycle looks like. Lastly is, how do we structure this? We get a lot of that conversation I hear is, hey, we just don't know what we don't know. Right? Is, we've got this money, but we haven't set up the structure yet. And we don't really know how to start and begin that structure on how to set up for building for those different timeframes and these competing projects and these competing priorities. How do we set up a structure that kind of aligns with this? So these are very common. And what I would say is there's good and bad here is that maybe the bad news is these don't go away. No matter what model you choose to use, these are always going to be conflicting components. But in my opinion, the good part about this is you can plan for these and set up processes and steps that hopefully help alleviate some of the volatility that comes from these stages of tension. So let's talk about the true tribal paradox. The challenge is tribal leadership, especially elected officials, are there to plan for 7 generations. It's in Indian country, that is a very common theme, is we want to plan for the next 7 generations. How do you do that while governing within 2 to 4 year election cycles? And again, those are elected officials that have to be re-elected, but it's also non-elected officials that have to answer to a tribal council and have to understand that these are the elected people and I have to execute on their plans. So whether you're part of an election or a side component of the election and a true hired individual, these pressures are still real, and this is a primary challenge, especially in tribal, governments where social components and revenue often intermingle. Multiple sources of risk. Again, volatility and risk is not just stock market, right? That's where it's predominantly listed, and that's where you hear about it. But there's also operational volatility and risk. There's also revenue volatility and risk, which I'll get into in here in a bit, but also in leadership transitions. Again, volatility is going to, if you're in a 2 to 4 year election cycle and you're planning for 7 generations out, there's going to be some different approaches on how they think the best way to do that can be done. So those leadership transitions add a level of volatility and risk that have to be understood before you set up any structure to kind of plan for the long-term future. So now that I've talked a little bit about the problems, let's talk a little bit about the solutions. Here's our opinion at IndiWealth. We believe a time horizon model is the most effective method for helping to alleviate some of the pressures. Again, these pressures never go away. You have to understand that as part of your role as a CFO, as an executive director, or as an elected official, that these competing priorities will always be prevalent. But I believe, and we believe here at IndiWealth, that establishing a treasury model that incorporates time horizon as part of the mission is a great way to both set up the structure, but also communicate that structure to your citizenship to help them understand what you're trying to achieve. And so I just think about it in 3 different fashions here, or the buckets, if you will. And the first one is the near-term bucket, and that's operating cash and rainy day holdings. That's your 0 to 2 years, right? That is covering the things you need to do, the day-to-day, making sure that your bills are paid, right? And that also, if something were to happen, and we'll talk about some of the pressures of things that can happen, and certainly a lot can happen in tribal governments. Do you have a contingency plan? Do you have rainy day holdings that you can use and tap into if something were to occur? And so I always use those as that's your short-term bucket, right? Is covering, making sure you're paying your bills and making sure you can still pay your bills if something were to happen. The second one is kind of your intermediate bucket, right? What do we want to do from a capital perspective? What are the goals we have in the next 3 to 5 years to establish, whether that's a capital project, whether that's a building, whatever that may be, whatever that goal and mission is, it has a more specific time frame of the next, you can use 5 years, you can use 7 years. I think of things in 1 to 7 year time frames about how do we establish funds to make sure we have them available when we need to do these projects. And so setting that up, also, again, from our perspective, understanding what that is and how to set that up also tells people is like, okay, here's what our priorities are for the next 5 years. Here's how we're funding them. Then the last one is once you have your bills covered and you have your rainy day contingency planning, and now you have your projects, everything else kind of fits into what do we want to do long term. And again, it should be kind of set in like, hey, what do we want to accomplish? Whether that's a minor's trust, we want to establish that so our future generations receive some of this money and we can allow it to grow and get there. Do we want to set up a perpetual fund for whatever services we want to continue to provide or enhance the services that we provide? These are the kinds of things that are long-term assets. And so setting it up in this structure, again, in our opinion, provides mission clarity. So now you know where everything is. You have an account that's set up for it. You can communicate like this money is set aside for this money is set aside for that. You know where that is. It protects your sovereignty and self-sustainability. Again, you receive, whether it's a one-time or whether it's a recurring revenue profile, you want to use that to enhance your independence. And in understanding where you are, especially that contingency planning, allows you to maintain that economic sovereignty. It allows you to create that self-sustainability that allows you to, again, not only sustain what you're doing now, but grow and sustain as you go forward. Lastly, and this is where we come into play, is we want to ensure the investments align with the mission. So us here at IndiWealth, we're investment managers. And so when this is established, and we can certainly help you establish these goals and allocations, But really, there are investments that align with these time horizons better than others. And you should understand that risk. So, from an operating cash and rainy day holding perspective, we should be taking very little risk in that. That should be, hey, we generate some income, but if things go awry, this money's still here. We know it's there. We've really planned for it. We don't take a lot of downside risk here. We're just generating this money. We'll generate some income. We'll have it working for us a little bit, but we're not going to take a whole heck of a lot of risk here. In fact, we're going to take very little risk at all. Long-term assets, very different approach. And again, this doesn't take into personal or even tribal risk tolerance levels. We often hear that about what's your risk tolerance? Well, I think risk tolerance is very, very, very dependent on your time to achieve. And so you can be a risk averse investor, but if you have a perpetual fund or something that's 25 years down the road, that is a very different, you want that money working for you over a longer period of time, taking more short-term risk where it might bounce around a little bit more, but being able to allow it to grow and work for you during that period of time and continue it on and be able to grow what you want to do with those assets. You have to allow for some short-term volatility so you can achieve the upside of long-term growth. That's how time horizon plays, because you know which bucket is which, and you know how you're invested in those allocations. So why does this work? Again, I was talking about Treasury and finance departments face a lot of different avenues, whether it's revenue volatility, things go up, things go down. Economic cycles tend to be cyclical, right? We have booms, we have busts. Those kinds of things happen all the time. Economic downturn, especially in Indian country, tends to affect it a little bit more because there's that social aspect that goes along with that revenue, right? The revenue comes into the tribe tries to organize it in a fashion that helps their citizens. So when economic downturns happen and there's less revenue coming in, it tends to be more sensitive in Indian country, even compared to the average. So you have to plan for that. I think all of you, at least a lot of you that I've talked to, talk about unpredictable federal funding cycles. And especially in this administration now, there seems to be a lot more in the air. But as I've talked with more and more people who've been in it longer than certainly I have, and just very long in general, they say, this is not unique to any particular administration. Might be more heightened now. There might be more concern about it now and more funding and issues. But this isn't unique to this cycle, is that, the federal government generally has not been the most reliable partner on the planet. And just like we were talking about leadership transitions happen all the time in Washington, and priorities change and things get adjusted. And you have to understand that. The last three are a little bit more structural in nature, is that obviously I said before, competing budget pressures. There's always going to be immediate needs and things that the citizens of your tribe want to accomplish. It's totally understandable. And there's going to be pressures of that versus long-term building where they don't see the benefit immediately, but over a longer period of time, reap the rewards of that planning. Political transitions, the transition from one to another, oftentimes elected officials and, incumbents versus new people coming in have very different ideas about how to attack things and how to do things and how to, make the citizenry better. So those political transitions can lead to volatility. And lastly is limited investment staffing. A lot of CFOs and treasurers, and this makes perfect sense, come from more accounting type, and they're working the day-to-day very aggressively, and that's what they need to accomplish. And so the investment component isn't something they have a lot of expertise with history, and also tends to be a little bit more longer term planning where, hey, I can do that when my hair's not on fire anymore, right? So the investment component is often outsourced, which is absolutely fine, as long as the person or firm you are outsourcing to understands what you're trying to do from a mission perspective and understands your community. I think that's absolutely essential. It's what we strive to do here at IndiWealth, is that when we come in as a partner, we want to understand you all and your situations and what you're trying to accomplish before we give you anything with regard to an investment plan. In our opinion, establishing time horizon models works with a lot of these conflicts to at least clear up the frameworks on how you're going to deal with them. Because again, these things don't go away. and also leads to less crisis-led decision-making, or that hair-on-fire decision-making, as I said before, is that during these periods of time, you can lean on the planning you've done. You have contingency plans. You have short-term cash. Your next 2 years of short-term cash needs are covered. These kinds of things have been planned for in place. You also have processes that you're covering that keep you on track, even when all these volatility sources seem to be going against you, which will happen in the future. And you want a partner that can help you out with that. So I always talk about just kind of the costs. When I talk about solution, and what's cost of not doing it. Well, in this instance here, I think the cost in a lot of tribes that I've seen is that holding too much cash limits your long-term growth. Well, we don't know what we want to do with this just yet, so we're going to hold it here for the time frame, and the time frame ends up being, oh, we're going to next couple months. Oh, we got an election cycle coming up. Let's hold off. And then it's a couple years and cash has been in the entire time without being delineated into what we're trying to do with that money. In that instance, cash holdings feel safe, but it's also really limiting your long-term growth. If this is established for a perpetual need and you know where those buckets are, but you've also covered that contingency planning, you can establish these for long-term growth to make that money work for you. I think that's the biggest opportunity in Indian country that I've seen, is that using these assets and using these resources to create more resources by growing that pie over time is something that is definitely achievable. I see this a little less, but it does happen, is that short-term assets may hold too much risk. I usually see this a little bit more outside Indian country, to be honest with you, is that, a forecast of the market. Well, I think, market's a good deal right now. So I think I should buy, I'll use a little bit of my short-term money that I need in the next 8 months. I don't need it for 8 months. I can buy the market on the cheap right now, make a little bit more money and feel great about myself. Be very careful with that, is that establishing, stock market does very well over a long period of times. It's a little bit more predictable during that period of time. In 6 to 8 month timeframes, it's extraordinarily unpredictable. Your range can be plus 50% to minus 40%, right? So you just don't incorporate a lot of long-term risk in your short-term bucket. I think that's a very difficult proposition, and honestly leads to a lot of questions to need being answered if that happens and it goes against you. Long-term assets used to plug short-term holes. Again, from our opinion here, establishing those and buckets and understanding what they're using for. Because again, you don't want to use your stock component. If stocks are down, it's like, oh, we needed that money to plug a short-term hole that we have. Better to have a contingency plan and know that you have that for the most part covered, and then secondarily use the remaining assets to grow that pie over a longer period of time. Because then if the market does have difficulty, well, you're not having to pull during times when things are way down. You're using your contingency during that period of time. Lastly is confusion between departments, committees, and constituents. There's a lot of, without setting up a structure, there's competing priorities, there's committees that are talking to one another, there's departments that have to talk to them, and there you can play the telephone game, right? You can have very different conversation from point A to point D or E, right? So you have to understand that establishing this framework allows for a little bit more clear communication between everyone, because you've set the assignments for those funds and how you're going to use them. Aligning liquidity with tribal missions is absolutely, in my opinion, essential. The time-based framework is just, in our opinion, the best way to do that. So strategic implementation. I'm not going to cover this aggressively, but really Treasury implementation steps, knowing what you have, setting that time horizon, building the IPS to match what you're trying to do. I think that's the biggest thing that tribes can do, is setting that in your investment policy statement, so you know what you're trying to do and you're delineating it in the proper fashion. Then it just becomes building and executing after that, and then reviewing going forward, making sure you're still on progress, making sure things are getting done. If something changes, then you may have to adjust. You may have to go back to the IPS and make some adjustments because you want to do something different with the money. That's fine. IPSs are never set in stone, but you have to understand that that's where you should go back to, is, okay, we have a different thought about a mission. We've had a leadership transition that wants to do something different. How do we incorporate that into the policy statement so that we continue to move forward? The process checklists, again, this is just setting up checklists to understand how you're going to do this going forward. I think the leadership transition is the biggest one in this regard, is that establishing a process about here's how we do this and here's how we set this up and here's what we monitor going forward allows incoming treasurers, new membership to the council, or a recent hire in the finance department an avenue to get caught up to speed relatively quickly. I think those are essential from a checklist just to help from those transitional elements to not get you off track with, again, the long-term planning that you've been trying to do. Then lastly, the Treasury calendar is monthly, quarterly, annually. Monthly is kind of an oil check, if you will, an oil change. It's just making sure, hey, do we have enough operating cash? What's our budget look like? Making sure we have the liquidity to cover the things we need. Quarterly is, are we progressing in the same in the fashion that we expect to be? Quarter to quarter, markets can fluctuate and it's adjustment. You should never make too irrational decisions around quarter to quarter performance, but at least you should be understanding and, hey, are we progressing in the proper fashion? If we're not, what are we changing to do so? That kind of stuff. Then I think lastly, annually, it should be taken back. You should take a step back and just say, are the things we're trying to do the things we still want to do? And if that's the case, great. If it's not, we need to reassess what we're doing. We need to evaluate new projects. We need to do the things we need to do. And then we need to review our investment policy statement to make sure it's still on now the new track that we've adjusted, or that, hey, we haven't made any adjustments and we're fine. I think it really is important to take a step back at least once a year and just kind of understand that. It may be a 3-minute thing. It may not take very long at all, but it may also be something you want to take advantage of. Is like, okay, we are now off track, and you can find yourself, 3 to 5 years with the same investment policy statement where now your missions are completely different from what your document says. So I think once a year, it just makes sense to at least examine that and understand where you are. So we have here at IndiWealth, we've developed our Treasury Playbook for tribal nations. It basically just kind of gives more information on the things I just covered, why we think the time horizon playbook is the best approach for tribal governments to take, how we would delineate that, what it's for, all that stuff. So it's a little bit more in depth than what I've given here. If you're interested in a copy of that, I will have a link in the description below. It is a flip book, so you can feel free to take a look at it. It will be your resource to use, but it is just there to give you a little bit more detail about the things we've covered here. So hopefully that was helpful. I hope you got a little bit out of this. Tune in next week where we'll have our next hot button tribal finance issue. But until then, thank you very much for joining us and take care.